Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from and at what time, so I can get to know you better. To support the channel for free, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. In the pre-dawn hours of September 2nd, 1666, London was a city sleeping on a razor's edge. A metropolis of timber-framed houses and narrow, winding streets, it had just begun to recover from the horrors of the Great Plague. But deep within a small bakery on a lane ominously named Pudding, a forgotten ember was about to awaken. This single spark would ignite an inferno so vast, so ferocious, that it would erase the medieval city from existence and forever scar the annals of history. This is the story of the 4 days that consumed London. The Great Fire that brought a world superpower to its knees. Tell us in the comments where in the world you are watching from and at what time, so I can get to know you better. To support the channel for free, don't forget to subscribe and like the video. Welcome to a story of royal ruin, public rebellion, and a woman who refused to be erased. This is the tale of Caroline of Brunswick and the king who hated her. To understand the inferno that their lives would become, we must first look at the city that served as its stage, London. In the late 18th century, London was not a city of brick and stone, but a tinderbox of ideas and resentments. The reign of King George III was winding down in a haze of intermittent madness, leaving the nation in the hands of his son, the Prince Regent, the future George IV. The prince was a man of exquisite taste and ruinous appetites. He built opulent palaces, collected fine art, and amassed debts so colossal they threatened to bankrupt the state. While he indulged in a life of decadent excess with his mistresses, the common people faced the harsh realities of war with France, rising food prices, and political suppression. A chasm was growing between the gilded world of the aristocracy and the grim existence of the masses. Radical new ideas about liberty, equality, and the rights of the people were spreading like wildfire, fanned by pamphlets and whispered in taverns. The monarchy, once a symbol of stability, was increasingly seen as a corrupt and extravagant burden. The Prince Regent, with his profligate spending and scandalous personal life, became the focal point of this public anger. He was a caricature of royal entitlement, utterly detached from the people he was meant to one day rule. This city, this society, was primed for a crisis. It was a volatile mixture of aristocratic arrogance and popular fury, waiting for a single spark to set it all ablaze. And that spark was about to arrive from a minor German duchy. A princess named Caroline, who had no idea she was stepping into the heart of the fire. Every great fire starts with a single spark in an unassuming place. For the catastrophic royal marriage of George and Caroline, that Pudding Lane was a drawing room in St. James's Palace, and the spark was their very first meeting. In 1794, Prince George was £40,000 in debt, an astronomical sum equivalent to hundreds of millions today. Parliament offered a deal. They would clear his debts if he would do his royal duty and marry a suitable Protestant princess. His choice, made sight unseen, was his first cousin, Caroline of Brunswick. She was described as good-humored and kind, but also loud, unrefined, and with a questionable approach to personal hygiene. Unaware of the purely financial nature of the arrangement, Caroline journeyed to England with the romantic hopes of any young bride. She expected a fairy tale. What she received was a nightmare. When she was presented to her future husband in April 1795, the meeting was an instant disaster. Prince George, a man obsessed with elegance and refinement, took one look at his boisterous, plainly dressed fiancée and was utterly appalled. He said nothing to her. He turned to his courtier, the Earl of Malmesbury, and declared, "I am not well. Pray get me a glass of brandy." He then walked to the far end of the room and stood there, speaking to his mistress, Lady Jersey, who was, cruelly, also appointed as one of Caroline's ladies-in-waiting. Caroline, for her part, was equally unimpressed, later confiding that the prince was fat and nothing like as handsome as his portrait. The brandy did little to help. The prince was cold and hostile for the remainder of their brief encounter. This single moment, this mutual and visceral revulsion, was the spark. It was not a grand political betrayal or a public declaration of war, but a quiet, personal catastrophe in a private room. Yet, from this disastrous first impression, an inferno of hatred would grow, consuming not just their lives, but threatening the very foundations of the British monarchy. Despite the catastrophic first meeting, the wedding went ahead just 3 days later. The state demanded an heir, and George desperately needed his debts paid. The ceremony was a grim spectacle, a public performance of a union that was already dead. Prince George was so drunk he had to be physically supported by 2 dukes to make it to the altar. He reportedly wept through the service, his eyes fixed not on his bride, but on his mistress, Lady Jersey. Caroline, meanwhile, stood beside him, a portrait of stoic dignity in the face of profound public humiliation. If the ceremony was a farce, the wedding night was a tragedy. The first fatal hours of their marriage sealed its doom with horrifying finality. According to Caroline's own account, the prince spent most of the night in a drunken stupor, eventually passing out in the fireplace grate, where he remained until the morning. It was a union consummated, it seems, on only a handful of occasions, driven purely by the dynastic need for a child. Miraculously, this brief and loveless coupling was successful. Exactly 9 months after the wedding, Caroline gave birth to their one and only child, Princess Charlotte. For George, this was the end of his obligation. With an heir secured, he had no further use for his wife. Within weeks of Charlotte's birth, he formally separated from Caroline. He wrote her a letter stating they could now live their lives as they pleased, separate and apart. He banished her from his primary residence, Carlton House, and established her in a separate, less prestigious home. Most cruelly, he severely restricted her access to their infant daughter, limiting her visits to a few stolen hours a week. These first hours and days were not merely a rocky start, they were a definitive end. The fire of their mutual loathing, ignited at their first meeting, was now an uncontrollable blaze, fueled by George's cruelty and Caroline's growing resentment. The battle lines were drawn. In the face of a growing fire, decisive action is required. But the British establishment, a collective Lord Mayor, personified by the king and his government, hesitated. They utterly misjudged the nature of the blaze. Caroline's mistreatment had ignited in the public's imagination. Their strategy was one of containment and quiet suppression, but their indecisiveness only allowed the flames to spread. While Prince George retreated further into his private world of lavish construction projects and secluded parties at his Brighton pavilion, Caroline began a new life in the public eye. Cast out from the formal court, she established her own rival one. She was flamboyant, charitable, and openly defied the stiff conventions of the aristocracy. She cultivated friendships with radical politicians who opposed the government, turning her personal grievance into a powerful political weapon. The people saw this, and they responded. They didn't see a coarse, undignified German princess. They saw a wronged wife and a devoted mother, deprived of her child by a debauched, selfish tyrant. The government, at George's behest, reacted clumsily. They launched what became known as the Delicate Investigation in 1806, a secret inquiry into rumors of Caroline's own alleged infidelities. They hoped to find evidence to officially disgrace her, perhaps even secure a divorce. But the investigation was a fiasco. The evidence was flimsy, based on the testimony of disgruntled servants, and the commission ultimately cleared her of adultery, though it did criticize her improper behavior. This attempt to destroy her backfired spectacularly. It transformed her from a victim into a martyr. The government's hesitation to either fully exonerate her or definitively condemn her left her in a powerful state of limbo. They had shown their hand, they wanted to be rid of her, but had failed to land a killing blow. This hesitation gave Caroline and her supporters time and ammunition. The scandal was no longer a private royal squabble. It was a national cause, a symbol of the people against a corrupt and hated ruler. The year is 1806. For Caroline, Princess of Wales, the tranquility of a Sunday, a day meant for quiet reflection, is about to be shattered. An unholy inferno is being kindled, not with flint and steel, but with whispers and accusations. Her estranged husband, the Prince of Wales, a man who found her repulsive from their first meeting, had long sought a way to be rid of her. Now, he believed he had found his weapon. The spark was a series of rumors, carefully cultivated and delivered by Caroline's high society enemies, Sir John and Lady Douglas. They alleged that the princess had engaged in shockingly inappropriate behavior, and most damningly, had given birth to an illegitimate child named William Austen, whom she was raising as her own. This was the moment George had been waiting for. He convinced his father, King George III, to authorize a secret inquiry, which would become known as the Delicate Investigation. It was anything but delicate. It was a brutal, clandestine tribunal designed to destroy a woman's reputation. 4 of the most powerful men in the kingdom, the Prime Minister, the Lord Chancellor, the Lord Chief Justice, and the Lord Privy Seal, were tasked with uncovering the truth. They descended upon Caroline's household, interrogating her servants, companions, and anyone who had ever been in her orbit. Her private life was systematically dismantled and examined under a microscope of malice. Every friendly gesture, every unguarded moment was twisted into evidence of impropriety. The pressure was immense. Caroline was isolated, surrounded by a court loyal to her husband, with her every move scrutinized. The investigation was a Star Chamber proceeding held in secret, where she had no right to legal counsel, no right to face her accusers, and no knowledge of the specific charges until they were leaked. This was not a search for truth. It was a witch hunt. The inferno of scandal was lit, intended to consume her entirely and clear the path for George to discard her. But fire is unpredictable. While it was meant to destroy Caroline, the flames would soon leap beyond the palace walls, threatening to engulf the monarchy itself in a blaze of public outrage. Though the delicate investigation ultimately cleared Caroline of adultery, it censured her for undignified behavior. The damage was done, and the court remained a hostile territory. By 1814, weary of the constant surveillance and ostracism, Caroline made a fateful decision. She accepted a generous allowance and left England for a life of self-imposed exile on the continent. For her husband, the Prince Regent, this was not an end, but an opportunity. As Caroline traveled, a metaphorical east wind began to blow, a chilling current of espionage and deceit, carrying treachery across Europe. George was obsessed with securing a divorce, and for that, he needed irrefutable proof of adultery. He established the Milan Commission in 1818, a shadowy organization funded by the British Secret Service, with a single objective: to find or fabricate evidence that would ruin his wife. Led by Sir John Leach, this commission hired a network of spies, disgruntled former servants, and paid informants. Their chief target was Caroline's relationship with her Italian chamberlain, Bartolomeo Pergami. Every aspect of their association was scrutinized and embellished. Did they dine together? It was proof of impropriety. Did he manage her household? He was her paramour. The commission's agents offered exorbitant bribes for testimony, no matter how perjured. They constructed a lurid narrative of debauchery, piecing together half-truths and outright lies into a damning portfolio. The treacherous wind carried these reports back to London, where they were eagerly received by the Prince Regent and his ministers. They believed they were building an unassailable case. For Caroline, living under this constant, invisible siege was a nightmare. She knew she was being watched, her reputation being systematically poisoned from afar. The treachery of the east wind was relentless, a testament to the depths of her husband's hatred and the willingness of the state to become his personal instrument of vengeance. The evidence they gathered, tainted as it was, would become the foundation for the greatest royal scandal Britain had ever seen. In January 1820, the long, troubled reign of King George III finally came to an end. Caroline's husband, the Prince Regent, ascended the throne as King George IV. His first act concerning his wife was one of pure spite. He demanded his ministers omit her name from the liturgy of the Church of England, effectively denying her status as queen in the eyes of God and the nation. He offered her an increased annuity of $50,000 a year, a fortune, on one condition: she must remain abroad and never use the title of Queen of England. For any other woman, it might have been a tempting offer to live in quiet luxury. But Caroline was not any other woman. She was a fighter. She refused the bribe, declaring, "It is my intention to return to England forthwith." This declaration triggered her great exodus. It was a journey not just across land and sea, but from the status of a forgotten exile to that of a defiant queen, ready to claim her birthright. Her voyage from Italy through France to the English coast was a spectacle. News of her approach preceded her, and in Britain, public sentiment, already simmering against the decadent and hated new king, boiled over in her favor. She became a symbol of the oppressed, a champion for every person who had ever felt wronged by the powerful. When she landed at Dover on June 5, 1820, she was not met by royal guards but by a roaring crowd of thousands. They unhitched the horses from her carriage and pulled it themselves, a profound act of popular support. Her subsequent journey to London was a triumphal procession. The final stage of her exodus brought her to the banks of the Thames, to the very heart of her husband's power. She took up residence at the home of Alderman Matthew Wood, a radical politician. Her arrival a direct, public challenge to the king's authority. She had not come to negotiate her surrender. she had come to fight. The Thames, the lifeblood of London, now bore witness to the arrival of a queen who, backed by the people, was about to plunge the monarchy into an unprecedented crisis. With Queen Caroline firmly established in London and hailed as a popular hero, the government, under intense pressure from King George IV, was forced to act. The work week of this national drama began on a fateful Monday. The King's ministers, led by Lord Liverpool, initiated proceedings against her. They chose not a standard criminal trial, which would have required a jury and could have resulted in a verdict of not guilty, but a more insidious legislative process. They introduced a bill in the House of Lords known as the Pains and Penalties Bill. This was a piece of legislation designed to achieve two goals: to strip Caroline of the title of Queen Consort and to annul her marriage to the king on the grounds of adulterous conduct. It was, in effect, a trial by Parliament, where the Lords would act as both judge and jury. The introduction of this bill set the financial heart of the nation ablaze. The cost to the state was astronomical. The government had to pay for the prosecution, the defense, and, most controversially, the transportation and accommodation of a parade of dubious Italian witnesses dredged up by the Milan Commission, many of whom were being paid handsomely for their testimony. The public coffers were being drained to satisfy the king's personal vendetta. This expenditure ignited public fury. Radicals and reformers argued that taxpayer money was being burned on the altar of royal corruption while ordinary people suffered. The scandal also disrupted the City of London, the nation's financial center. Pro-Caroline demonstrations and riots became common, causing commercial activity to grind to a halt. The proceedings themselves, which began in August 1820, turned the House of Lords into a theater of the absurd. The sordid, explicit details of Caroline's alleged behavior in Italy were read aloud and printed verbatim in newspapers, eagerly consumed by a scandalized public. The king had intended to disgrace his wife, but in doing so he set fire to the dignity of the crown itself, exposing the monarchy's dirty laundry and immense financial waste to a deeply unimpressed and increasingly revolutionary-minded populace. The year is 1814. With Napoleon defeated and exiled to Elba, Europe breathes a collective sigh of relief. But for Caroline, Princess of Wales, the end of one war simply signals the beginning of another, more personal conflict. The fragile truce with her husband, the Prince Regent, had shattered. She was barred from court, publicly humiliated, and most cruelly, systematically separated from her beloved daughter, Charlotte. The home she had in England, Connaught House, was no longer a sanctuary, but a gilded cage, its walls echoing with the whispers of spies and the loneliness of her isolation. Her domestic world, the very castle of her royal identity, was under siege, not by a foreign army, but by her own husband. Recognizing that her position in Britain was untenable, Caroline made a fateful decision. She would go into exile. She sought permission from the regent to travel abroad, a request he granted with undisguised glee. For him, her departure was a victory, a way to remove the embarrassing spectacle of his estranged wife from public view. For Caroline, it was a desperate gamble for freedom. She left England a diminished figure, a princess without a court, a mother without her child. Her departure marked the true fall of her castle, the collapse of her official life within the British establishment. She established a new, flamboyant, and decidedly unconventional household on the continent, first in Brunswick, then journeying through Italy and the Mediterranean. This wandering court was a motley collection of adventurers, artists, and loyal retainers, a far cry from the stifling formality of London. It was here, in the sun-drenched villas of Lake Como and the dusty roads of the Near East, that she would build a new life, one that gave her the liberty she craved, but also provided the very ammunition her enemies needed to orchestrate her final downfall. While Caroline sought liberation in her travels, the Prince Regent was meticulously planning her destruction. He was not content with her mere absence. He required concrete proof of her infidelity to secure a divorce and deny her the eventual title of queen. Thus, in 1818, the regent's government established a secret committee that would become known as the Milan Commission. This was not a public inquiry, but a shadowy network of spies, lawyers, and informants tasked with one goal: to dig up any and all dirt on the errant princess. At its head were three men: Vice-Chancellor Sir John Leach, the lawyer John Allen Powell, and the barrister William Cook. They descended upon Milan, the nexus of Caroline's European life, and began their work. They became the Samuel Pepys's of this sordid saga. Their diaries not of London life, but of depositions, rumors, and paid-for testimony. Their eyewitnesses to Caroline's personal Armageddon were a cast of disgruntled servants, opportunistic locals, and ambitious couriers, all eager to trade scandal for cash. Chief among the alleged lovers they focused on was Bartolomeo Pergami, a handsome former Napoleonic soldier whom Caroline had elevated from courier to her chamberlain. Servants were bribed to recall intimate dinners, shared tents during her travels through the Holy Land, and whispers heard through keyholes. Theodore Majocchi, a former domestic, became a star witness, his testimony filled with salacious, if often contradictory, details. The Commission's agents, like the Hanoverian diplomat Baron von Ompteda, were relentless, even attempting to break into Caroline's villa to steal her private papers. Every letter was intercepted, every public appearance scrutinized, every friendship twisted into something sinister. The collected evidence, a mountain of hearsay and innuendo, was compiled into a green bag and sent back to London, a dossier of damnation waiting to be unleashed upon an unsuspecting nation. The work of the Milan Commission was intended to be a precise, surgical strike against Caroline's character, conducted in the shadows. But secrets of this magnitude rarely stay contained. As whispers of the investigation and its lurid findings began to seep out of Italy and into the press, the affair escalated from a private royal squabble into a full-blown national crisis. The very foundation of the monarchy, as sacred and seemingly immutable as St. Paul's Cathedral itself, began to groan under the strain. The public, already deeply resentful of the Prince Regent's extravagance, his vanity, and his scandalous personal life, saw the persecution of his wife as the height of hypocrisy. Here was a man, known for his own legion of mistresses and profligate spending, attempting to destroy a woman he had cast aside decades earlier. The radical press, led by firebrands like William Cobbett, seized upon the narrative. Caroline was transformed from a flawed and eccentric royal into a symbol of wronged womanhood, a brave heroine standing up to a corrupt and tyrannical establishment. The monarchy, which derived its authority from a carefully constructed image of piety, stability, and moral righteousness, now found itself at the center of a vulgar, public spectacle. The details were sordid, concerning sleeping arrangements, bathing habits, and public displays of affection. This was not the stuff of regal majesty. It was the content of gossip columns, now being debated in taverns, parlors, and pamphlets across the land. The roaring collapse was not of stone and mortar, but of deference and mystique. The crown was being stripped of its sacred veneer, revealing the all-too-human and deeply unsavory conflicts within. The scandal threatened to consume not just Caroline and her husband, but the very institution they represented, shaking the pillars of the state to their core. On January 29, 1820, the long, slow reign of the ailing King George III finally came to an end. The Prince Regent, who had ruled in his father's name for nearly a decade, ascended the throne as King George IV. The crisis, which had been simmering for years, now boiled over. Caroline was, by right of marriage, the Queen of the United Kingdom. It was a title George was determined she would never hold. No longer a prince constrained by his father's authority, George IV now wielded the full power of the state, and he intended to use it to solve his Caroline problem, once and for all. He resolved to take command. His first act was to demand his ministers introduce a bill into Parliament to dissolve his marriage and, crucially, to strip Caroline of her title and all associated rights. This was the infamous Pains and Penalties Bill. It was a political nuclear option, a legislative trial that bypassed the normal courts and put the Queen's fate in the hands of politicians. The government, led by Lord Liverpool, was deeply reluctant. They knew the bill would be massively unpopular and politically explosive. But the new king was intransigent. He threatened abdication, threw tantrums, and applied immense pressure, forcing his ministers' hands. While the king plotted in London, Caroline, now in Rome, heard the news of her husband's accession. She was no longer a cast-off princess. She was a sovereign. Her name was pointedly omitted from the Anglican liturgy, a petty but powerful snub that signaled the king's intentions. Far from being intimidated, Caroline was galvanized. She declared her intention to return to England to claim her rights and face her accusers. The stage was now set for the ultimate confrontation, a public trial in the House of Lords that would pit a hated king against a popular, defiant queen. The king's campaign against Caroline was a raging inferno designed to consume her reputation and her crown. But her legal team, led by the formidable Henry Brougham, refused to simply be burned. They decided to fight fire with fire. Their strategy was not merely defensive, it was a promise of mutual annihilation. If the king insisted on illuminating Caroline's alleged indiscretions in Italy, Brougham was prepared to light a fuse on a cache of explosives that lay directly beneath the throne itself. These were the crown's own gunpowder plots, a collection of secrets so damaging they threatened to blow the monarchy apart. Brougham's opening salvo was a veiled but unmistakable threat delivered to the House of Lords. He spoke of the duties of a wife, but also pointedly of the reciprocal duties of a husband. Every peer in the chamber understood the implication. The king's own life was a litany of excess, debt, and infidelity. His secret and illegal marriage to the Catholic Maria Fitzherbert was the ultimate weapon. To expose it would not just embarrass George, it would call into question the legitimacy of his reign and the entire line of succession. This was the doctrine of recrimination, a legal strategy where an accusation of adultery could be nullified if the accuser was also guilty. But in this context, it was more than a legal tactic. It was constitutional blackmail. The government, led by Prime Minister Lord Liverpool, was terrified. They were prosecuting the Queen on behalf of a king whose own scandals dwarfed hers. Brougham and his team began compiling their own dossier, a black book of the king's sins. The threat of its publication hung over the proceedings like a guillotine, making every move by the prosecution a dangerous gamble. They weren't just defending a queen. They were holding a match to the foundations of the Hanoverian dynasty, ready to set it ablaze if their client was sacrificed. As the trial dragged on, a palpable shift occurred on a pivotal Tuesday. The fire of public outrage, once a scattered series of bonfires in support of the Queen, began to coalesce into a single, roaring blaze. And that fire was turning west. It moved from the docks and the working-class districts of the East End, surging towards the heart of power, Westminster, and the affluent, aristocratic enclaves of the West End, where the king and his ministers resided. This was no longer just a legal spectacle. It was becoming a siege. Each morning, the crowds lining the route of Caroline's procession to Parliament grew larger, more vocal, and more menacing towards her enemies. Effigies of the Italian witnesses, particularly the despised Theodore Majocchi, were burned nightly. But now, the crowd's anger was directed at more prestigious targets. The Duke of Wellington, still a national hero for defeating Napoleon, was jeered and had his windows smashed for siding with the king. Other government peers found their London homes under constant threat, their carriages pelted with mud and stones. The mood was turning revolutionary. The press, particularly radical publications like William Cobbett's Political Register, fanned the flames, portraying Caroline as a symbol of every person oppressed by a corrupt and out-of-touch establishment. The trial became a focal point for all the grievances of post-war Britain: economic hardship, lack of representation, and a deep-seated hatred for the decadent king. On this particular Tuesday, the pressure became immense. Petitions flooded into Parliament. Delegations from trade guilds and towns across the country arrived to declare their loyalty to Caroline. The government was losing control not just of the trial's narrative, but of the streets of the capital. The fire was no longer contained within the House of Lords. It was licking at the gates of the king's palace, a populist inferno threatening to consume the very men who had ignited it. In the national imagination, the Tower of London stood as the ultimate symbol of royal authority and the unyielding power of the state. As the trial against Queen Caroline faltered, the government found itself engaged in a desperate defense of its own metaphorical tower, the institution of the monarchy and its own political survival. The prosecution's case was crumbling into dust. Their star witnesses, a parade of Italian servants and couriers, were systematically dismantled under Henry Brougham's merciless cross-examination. Their testimony was revealed to be a tapestry of contradictions, hearsay, and blatant lies, likely purchased with bribes from the crown. Theodore Majocchi's repeated farcical response, "Non mi ricordo," I do not remember, became a national punchline, a catchphrase for the absurdity of the government's case. With their evidence in tatters and public fury mounting outside, the ministers' defense of their position grew increasingly desperate. Prime Minister Lord Liverpool and Lord Chancellor Eldon could be seen frantically trying to shore up support within the House of Lords. The Pains and Penalties Bill, which was meant to be a swift execution of Caroline's royal status, had become a quagmire. They were no longer prosecuting a wayward queen, they were defending the king's honor. a task that grew more impossible by the day. Every attack on Caroline simply reminded the public of George's own far greater moral failings. The government was trapped. To press on with the bill risked igniting a full-blown insurrection. To withdraw it would be a humiliating surrender to the Queen and the mob, a catastrophic blow to the authority of the king and his government. This was their last stand. They were barricaded inside their tower of political power, with the walls cracking under the combined assault of a brilliant legal defense and the unshakable will of the people. The foundations of the state felt as though they were trembling. For weeks, the political winds had howled with revolutionary fervor, threatening to tear the government apart. But then, on November 10, 1820, came a merciful change. The Pains and Penalties Bill had agonizingly passed its second reading by a slim margin. But support was bleeding away. The final vote, the third reading, would decide everything. The chamber was thick with tension. The government whipped its supporters, pleading and threatening to muster every last vote. When the numbers were finally tallied, the bill passed, but by a majority of only 9 votes. 9. It was a victory so hollow it amounted to a catastrophic defeat. A majority this small was utterly unsustainable. There was no conceivable way the bill would ever pass the fiercely pro-Caroline House of Commons. To send it, there would be to invite certain defeat and escalate the national crisis to an unbearable new level. It was at this moment that the Prime Minister, Lord Liverpool, rose to his feet. The House fell silent. He acknowledged the razor-thin majority and the deeply divided state of the nation. Then, uttering the words that would echo across the country, he announced that the government would not be proceeding further with the bill. It was over. A wave of shock, then jubilation, swept through the chamber and spilled out into the streets. The wind had changed. The storm had broken. For Queen Caroline, it was a moment of absolute vindication. She had faced down the full power of the king and his state, and had won. For the government, it was a merciful escape from a disaster of their own making, allowing them to step back from the brink of revolution. London erupted in celebration for days. The city was illuminated, church bells rang, and the people rejoiced in the victory of their queen. The king had been defeated, not by a foreign army, but by his hated wife and the overwhelming force of public opinion. A wind of change he had been powerless to resist. The Bill of Pains and Penalties was dead. On November 10th, 1820, Lord Liverpool, seeing the government's majority dwindle to a mere 9 votes, announced its withdrawal. London erupted in a spontaneous festival of light and sound. For 2 nights, the city was illuminated, church bells pealed, and crowds surged through the streets, cheering for their vindicated queen. It was a staggering, undeniable victory for Caroline, a public repudiation of her husband's obsessive quest to destroy her. Yet, as the third day dawned, a metaphorical Wednesday, the brilliant flames of triumph began to cool, leaving behind the faint, lingering scent of smoke and the slow-dying embers of a Pyrrhic victory. The legal battle was won, but the war for her rightful place was far from over. King George IV, secluded and incandescent with fury, had lost the public trial, but still held all the institutional power. His response was swift and petty. He refused to restore Caroline's name to the Book of Common Prayer, a symbolic but deeply significant act that denied her status as queen in the eyes of the church and the nation's faithful. She was still barred from any royal palace and ostracized from court. The foreign ambassadors, taking their cue from the monarch, were instructed to shun her. The illuminations faded, the crowds dispersed, and Caroline was left in a gilded cage of victory. Her chief counsel, Henry Brougham, had achieved a monumental political success. But for Caroline, the woman at the center of the storm, the future was uncertain. She had the love of the common people, but she was isolated from the elite, the very circle in which a queen was meant to reside. The cheers had been intoxicating, a roar of approval that had sustained her through the grueling ordeal. But in the quiet that followed, she was forced to confront the cold reality. She had survived the fire, but the palace doors remained firmly locked against her. While Caroline grappled with her hollow victory, the political landscape she left behind was a smoldering ruin. The trial had been more than a domestic squabble. It was a constitutional crisis that had shaken the British establishment to its core. The primary casualty was the reputation of the king himself. For months, the press had gleefully published every sordid detail of the investigation, contrasting Caroline's alleged infidelities with George's own well-documented history of profligacy, adultery, and cruelty. He was no longer just an unpopular monarch. He was a laughingstock, a vindictive, bloated cuckold, lampooned in countless satirical cartoons and broadsheets. The public had not necessarily believed Caroline to be a saint, but they saw her as a wronged woman. And in her, they found a perfect vessel for their own deep-seated resentment towards a decadent and out-of-touch monarch. The Tory government, led by Lord Liverpool, was also severely damaged. Forced to prosecute the king's personal vendetta, they had expended immense political capital on a deeply unpopular cause. They had alienated a huge portion of the populace and had been made to look both foolish and tyrannical. The Whig opposition, while championing Caroline's cause, had also played a dangerous game, fanning the flames of popular discontent to score political points, bringing the country perilously close to widespread civil unrest. The entire affair left the institution of the monarchy itself tarnished. It had been stripped of its mystique, its dirty laundry aired for all the world to see. The sacred bond between the sovereign and the people was frayed, replaced by cynicism and contempt. The trial had forced open, deep fissures in British society, between radical and loyalist, rich and poor, and men and women. The crisis had passed, the bill was withdrawn, but the damage was done. The city of London was no longer illuminated with celebration, but shrouded in the political ash of a battle that had left no true victors, only varying degrees of ruin. In the acrid aftermath of the trial, the blame game began. A fiasco of this magnitude required scapegoats, and every faction scrambled to point the finger away from themselves. The king, of course, blamed his ministers. He raged that Lord Liverpool's government had bungled the prosecution, that they had lacked the nerve to see it through, and that their cowardice had led to his public humiliation. In his mind, the evidence was overwhelming. The failure lay entirely in its execution. For their part, the government privately cursed the king's obsessive and irrational hatred, which had forced them into this no-win situation from the very beginning. They had warned him of the political risks, but his royal will had been absolute. Now they were left to manage the fallout of his disastrous personal crusade. Attention also turned to the key figures who had gathered the evidence against the Queen. The so-called Milan Commission, a shadowy group of investigators hired to dig up dirt on Caroline's life in Italy, came under intense scrutiny. Their star witnesses, like the perjuring servants Theodore Majocchi and Louise Dumont, had been torn apart under cross-examination, their testimony exposed as a mixture of exaggeration and outright lies, likely purchased for a price. They became symbols of the corrupt foreign conspiracy, orchestrated to destroy an English queen, convenient villains for a public eager to believe the worst of the king's Italian spies. Even Caroline's own camp was not immune. Whispers grew that her advisors, particularly the ambitious Henry Brougham, had perhaps prolonged her suffering for their own political advancement. Had they advised her to reject early compromises that might have spared her the public ordeal? Had they used her popularity as a battering ram against the Tory government, with little regard for her personal well-being? Caroline herself was a complex figure in this hunt for blame. While seen as a victim, she was also criticized by some as reckless and naive, a woman whose eccentric behavior had given her enemies the ammunition they needed. In the end, there was more than enough blame to go around, a shared responsibility for a national disgrace that had left no one's hands truly clean. With the trial over and his public image in tatters, King George IV resolved to rebuild. His method was not one of reconciliation or reform, but of overwhelming spectacle. He would erase the memory of the squalid affair with a display of royal pageantry so magnificent it would dazzle the nation into submission. The instrument for this restoration was his coronation, planned for the summer of 1821. No expense was to be spared. This would be the most lavish, opulent, and theatrical coronation in British history, a deliberate and powerful statement of monarchical authority. A new London, in the king's eyes, was one where his legitimacy was unquestionable and his estranged wife was invisible. Architects and designers were commissioned to create a medieval fantasy within Westminster Abbey and Westminster Hall. New ermine-trimmed robes were designed, a new crown, the diamond diadem, still worn by the monarch today, was created, and an ancient tradition, the grand coronation banquet, was revived on a scale of unprecedented luxury. The cost spiraled to over $240,000, an astronomical sum at the time, equivalent to tens of millions today. This was the king's answer to the jeering mobs and satirical cartoons, a tidal wave of gold, velvet, and tradition designed to wash away the stain of the recent scandal. But as the immense preparations gathered pace, a critical question loomed. What of the Queen? Caroline, buoyed by her public support, was adamant. She was the rightful Queen of England, and she would be crowned alongside her husband. She formally demanded that a place be prepared for her at the ceremony. The king and his government flatly refused. The coronation was to be George's moment of reinvention, a carefully stage-managed performance of power. There was no role in this play for the woman who had so publicly defied and humiliated him. The stage was being set for a final, tragic confrontation. A clash between the king's vision of a rebuilt, obedient monarchy and the Queen's unyielding demand for her rights.